In 1927, a moonshiner named Cletus Boggs crouched in the laurel above his still on Coal Creek, Tennessee, and heard boots breaking twigs on the trail below him. He was not a violent man, but the men climbing toward his still in the dark were federal, and out here the law came armed. What he carried that night is now illegal in 34 states, and today the same tools would put him in a federal courtroom before the corn came in. Number 21 was so ordinary that revenue agents searched his cabin, held it, and set it back on the shelf without a second thought. And number 6 was so effective that modern game wardens have banned it across the entire southern range. Let us count them down. Number 25. Every man who ever worked a still in the dark knew the weight of a filled bung mallet swinging from his belt. It was a short-handled wooden mallet, head turned from seasoned hickory, used to drive the oak bungs into barrel holes and seat the caps on a fermenting mash. The head weighed close to 2 pounds, and the handle sat 10 inches long, short enough to swing one-handed in a cramped still shed. Coopers in Knoxville sold them for 40 cents in 1925, and every mash house on the Cumberland Plateau owned at least 3. The hickory was worn smooth and dark, where 1,000 grips had polished it. A man who carried a bung mallet was a working man, and no deputy ever thought twice. By the 1960s, courts had begun listing wooden mallets as bludgeons in assault filings. The cooper called it a tool. The judge called it intent. Number 24. Before hardware stores sold decorative fireplace sets, mountain families kept a single iron poker leaning by the hearth that did double work. It was a 3-foot rod of forged iron with a hooked tip, made to rake coals and lift the lid off a boiling washpot without burning a hand. Blacksmiths in Sevier County hammered them out for a quarter, and the good ones were heavy enough to crack a skull without bending. The iron rang faintly when it was set down against stone. A moonshiner kept one at the still and one at the cabin door, and neither one looked like anything but a fire tool. It said nothing about the man except that he heated his own home. By the 1970s, prosecutors were entering fireplace pokers into evidence as deadly weapons in dozens of cases a year. The hearth kept them innocent. The courtroom did not. Number 23. A tobacco knife was the short curved blade that hill farmers used to cut and split cured leaf for market. The blade ran 6 inches, hooked like a small sickle, ground sharp on the inside curve and dull on the back, so a man could rest his thumb along the spine. Farmers across the Blue Ridge carried them from August to frost, and a good one from the Sears catalog cost 35 cents in 1922. The curve caught the light like a fishhook when it was drawn from the sheath. A moonshiner working the fields between still runs wore one on his hip without a glance from anyone. It was harvest, and every man had a blade. When switchblade panic swept the country, general knife bans in the 1950s quietly folded the hooked tobacco knife into the list of forbidden edges. It cut leaf for 100 years, then it cut a man once, and the law remembered. Number 22. Not a weapon in the traditional sense, the sap glove was the plain leather work glove of the Appalachian mashman, with a difference. The knuckle panel was lined with a stitched-in pocket of lead shot or a thin sheet of poured lead, adding a pound of dead weight across the fist. Harness makers in Asheville built them on order for $1, and a man could buy the shot loose at any general store. The glove looked exactly like every other pair hanging by every other door. It felt heavy, in a way a working glove never should. A moonshiner shook hands with a stranger and knew, if the moment turned, his fist already carried a hammer inside it. The glove was warmth, and warmth was legal. Most states outlawed weighted gloves as concealed weapons by 1965. The cold was his cover, the lead was his answer. Number 21. This flat, heavy strap of leather with a lead core was built to look like nothing at all. Now here is where it gets strange, because revenue agents searched more than one moonshiner's cabin, picked this very tool off the shelf, turned it over and put it back. It was a leather blackjack, a spring shaft wrapped in stitched hide with a lead slug sewn into the wide flat head. Saddle shops in Chattanooga sold them for $1.50 in 1924, sized to slide into a hip pocket and vanish. The leather made a flat, dense sound against a table, nothing like a belt and nothing like a stick. It fit a still hand's palm like it had grown there. He carried it because a jug of white liquor drew men who did not knock. Police kept them into the 1980s. Civilians lost them in the 1950s. Number 20. A singletry was the wooden crossbar that hitched a mule to a plow or a sledge, drilled at each end for the trace chains. It ran 2.5 feet of solid ash, iron capped at the tips, and it swung with the reach of a baseball bat and twice the mass. Every farm on the mountain had a dozen, and a broken one leaned in every barn corner, waiting to be replaced for pennies. The iron caps were cold and pitted under a working hand. A moonshiner hauling mash barrels by mule kept singletrees stacked in his wagon, and no revenue man ever counted them as anything but harness. It was the plainest thing on the whole farm. When it turned up in enough tavern brawls, courts across Tennessee named the singletree a bludgeon by statute. The mule made it a tool. The magistrate made it a club. Number 19. Brace yourself, because this one is controversial. A slungshot is a lead ball or a smooth river stone wrapped in braided cord and swung from a short wrist loop. The whole thing measured under a foot and hid inside a closed hand, but a flick of the wrist turned it into a hammer, moving at the speed of a thrown rock. Rivermen and moonshiners on the Tennessee waterways plated them from bootlace and fishing line, and the lead cost nothing a man did not already own. It made a faint whisper of cord against sleeve when it dropped into the palm. He carried it because the river brought strangers, and strangers brought trouble. The slungshot was among the very first personal weapons banned outright, prohibited in most states before 1900. It was silent and cheap, and that was the trouble. The quiet ones scared the law the most. Number 18. Also called a persuader, the barrel bung starter was a long-handled wooden club coopers used to knock the bungs loose from a full barrel, turning a stuck cask into an open one with 2 swings. The head was a heavy oval of hard maple on an 18-inch handle, balanced to hit flush without splitting the wood beneath it. Distillery coopers and moonshiners alike kept one at every barrel rack, and a new one cost 50 cents in 1926. The maple thudded low and solid, a sound a man felt in his wrist before he heard it. A mash man with a bung starter in his fist was simply doing his job. That was the whole disguise. As states rewrote their weapons codes after Prohibition, the wooden persuader was folded into bans on billies and bludgeons. It opened barrels for a living. The law decided it opened heads too. Number 17. When the corn liquor ran low and a man had nothing else, every still hand knew a length of chain became a weapon in about 5 seconds. This was the trace chain, 4 feet of forged links that ran from the mule's harness to the singletree, and it lived coiled on every wagon on the mountain. Wrapped once around the fist with the free end swinging, it struck with a reach and a bite no club could match. A blacksmith sold a full trace for $1, and every farm owned a barn wall of them. The cold links clanked and settled when they were gathered up, a heavy metallic rustle in the dark. A moonshiner hauling barrels was never more than an arm's length from 4 feet of steel. It was harness, and harness broke no law. Chains as weapons were written into assault statutes, state by state, through the 1960s. It pulled the plow. Then it pulled a sentence. Number 16. That short, thick length of turned wood, no longer than a forearm, was the froe club a mountain man used to drive a froe through oak and split shingles. The head was a knot of dogwood, the hardest wood on the ridge, chosen because it would not crack under a season of hammering. Shingle makers across Appalachia cut their own, and the ones they sold at the Crossroads store went for a dime. The dogwood was dense as bone and just as pale where the bark was stripped away. A moonshiner who split his own roof shakes had one leaning in the shed, and it never once looked like a weapon. It was roofing, plain and simple. By the time modern courts got to it, any short, heavy club fell under billy club bans in most southern states. It split cedar for the cabin roof. It could split far more than that. Number 15. A cane knife was the long, heavy blade sugar farmers swung to cut sorghum cane at the base, the mountain cousin of the machete. The blade stretched 16 inches, thick-spined and slightly hooked, ground to shave through a fist-thick stalk in a single stroke. Sorghum was the sweetener of every hollow, and a moonshiner grew it beside his corn, so a cane knife hung in every mash house shed. The catalog price was 60 cents in 1921. The steel had a low ring to it when it flexed, and a shine along the edge that never quite dulled. A man walking his fields with a cane knife was farming, and farming was invisible. The blade said only that he made his own molasses. General blade-length bans of the 1950s swept the cane knife up with the rest. It cut sweetness from the field. The law only saw the edge. Number 14. This is the part nobody got right. Brass knuckles in their purest form, 4-finger holes cast in a single bar of solid brass with a rounded palm rest to brace the blow. A mail-order house in Cincinnati shipped them to any mountain address for 90 cents in 1923, no questions asked and no record kept. The brass was worn smooth and gold dark by handling, cool and heavy in a coat pocket. A moonshiner who walked his liquor down to a buyer at night slipped them on before he ever saw a face. They added no length to a punch. They transferred all of it. Brass knuckles were among the earliest weapons banned by name, prohibited in most states before 1930, and a felony to carry today. Your great-grandfather bought them from a catalog. His great-grandson would lose his freedom for the same purchase. Number 13. A step beyond the plain walking stick, the loaded cane was a hardwood staff, bored hollow at the head and filled with a core of poured lead. It looked like the cane of an aging man, and it walked like one, but the weighted head swung with the authority of an iron bar. Cane makers in Roanoke turned them on order for $2 in 1926, and no one who leaned on one drew a second glance. The lead gave it a nose-heavy pull a real cane never had. A moonshiner growing old on the mountain carried one to town and to church, upright and respectable, armed the entire time. It was age, and age asked no questions. Courts named loaded canes as concealed bludgeons through the 1950s and 60s. The grey hair was the disguise. The lead was the truth beneath it. Number 12. Every man who kept livestock owned a set of hoof nippers, and every man who owned them knew the long iron handles made a formidable club. They were built to trim a mule's hoof, 2 forged arms 1.5 feet long meeting at a heavy cutting jaw, and the leverage that cut horn would crush far worse. A farrier's pair cost $1.25, and no working farm on the ridge went without them. The iron was cold and scarred, and the joint gave a dry metallic click when the handles closed. A moonshiner who shod his own mules kept them hanging in the barn, and they were the least suspicious object he owned. They belonged to the animals. When assault charges started naming farm implements, the courts made room for these too. They trimmed a hoof. They could break an arm. Number 11. A froe itself, not the club that drove it, was the L-shaped splitting blade every shingle maker on the mountain owned. a foot of dull-backed iron blade set at a right angle into a stout wooden handle. Swung by that handle, it became a heavy hooked hatchet. The good ones came out of a Severfile forge for 75 cents in 1924, and a moonshiner who roofed his own still shed had one within reach. The iron was pitted and dark, warm from the sun where it leaned against the wall. It made shakes for the roof and asked nothing more of him than that. To any agent who saw it, it was carpentry. Most states never wrote a fro into their weapons codes at all, and so it stayed legal long after its cousins were banned. The law never found a reason to take it. Number 10. Also worn by nearly every laboring man, the wide leather belt of the mountain moonshiner carried a heavier buckle than fashion ever required. It was a slab of cast brass, half a pound and squared at the corners, on a belt of thick harness leather 2 fingers wide. A man unbuckled it, wrapped the leather twice around his fist, and swung 6 inches of brass at the end of a leather lash. Belts and buckles cost under $1 at any dry goods counter, and every man on the ridge owned one by necessity. The brass clinked once against the leather when it swung loose. A moonshiner was never unarmed, because a man cannot be arrested for holding up his own trousers. No law could outlaw a belt, and no man who wore one was ever truly unarmed. Number 9. This entry belongs to the women. A darning egg was the smooth wooden ball on a short handle that mountain wives slipped inside a sock to mend the heel, and in a fist it struck like a stone. It was turned maple, the size of a hen's egg with a 4-inch grip, and it fit the hollow of a hand as if made for it. Notion counters sold them for a nickel, and every cabin on the mountain had one in the sewing basket. The maple was polished glass smooth by years of thread and use. A moonshiner's wife, left alone at the still, while her man walked the liquor down, kept the darning egg in her apron, and no revenue man ever searched a sewing basket. It mended socks. That was all anyone saw. It appeared in no weapons law ever written, because no legislator imagined it. Some things stayed legal only because nobody thought to fear them. Number 8. Stop. This next one breaks the pattern entirely. A tap hammer was the small square-faced hammer a cooper used to seat the metal hoops down tight on a barrel, and it weighed a pound of solid steel on a stubby handle. The face was ground flat, and the pole came to a blunt wedge, and the whole thing measured barely 8 inches, made to hide in a fist. Coopers and moonshiners bought them for 30 cents at any hardware counter in 1925. The steel head was cold, and the handle worn pale where a thumb always rode. A mashman tapping hoops at his barrel rack had the deadliest small tool on the mountain in his hand and looked like nothing but a workman. It set the hoops that held his liquor. By the 1960s, small concealed hammers were being named in concealed weapon filings across the region. It tightened barrels. It was written up as a bludgeon. Number 7. A corn knife was the long, straight blade mountain farmers swung to cut standing corn at harvest, flat and heavy, and ground on one edge. It ran 14 inches with a squared tip, more cleaver than sword, built to shear through a thick stalk with one downward chop. Every corn patch on the plateau needed a dozen at harvest, and the catalog sold them for 45 cents in 1922. The blade had a dull, heavy shine and a balance that pulled toward the tip. A moonshiner cut his mash corn with the same blade he might one day need after dark, and no one on the mountain thought twice about a man with a corn knife in October. It was the harvest, and the harvest armed everyone. Blade-length statutes in the 1950s pulled the corn knife off the legal shelf. It fed the still all its life. Then the law called it a sword. Number 6. A gig was the barbed, multi-pronged spear mountain men jabbed into the shallows to take frogs and fish by lantern light. Brace yourself, because this one is still fought over. 3 to 5 iron tines, each barbed like a fishhook, socketed onto a 6-foot ash shaft and honed to slide in and hold. Every hollow with a creak had gig makers, and a fine 5-tine head came out of the forge for 50 cents in 1923. The barbs caught the lantern light in a row of small wet points. A moonshiner gigging frogs below his still after dark carried a 6-foot barbed spear and called it supper. It fed his family from the creek. But modern wildlife codes have banned or sharply restricted gigging across most of the southern range, and a barbed spear is now a citation in 38 states. It fed the mountain for 2 centuries. Now the warden calls it poaching. Number 5. A mattock was the heavy 2-headed digging tool every homesteader swung to break new ground, an axe blade on one side and a broad adze on the other. The head weighed 5 pounds of forged iron on a 3-foot hickory handle built to cut roots and chop clay in the same stroke. A moonshiner clearing a hidden patch for his corn owned one by necessity, and the hardware store sold them for $1.25 in 1924. The iron was orange scaled with rust at the eye and bright where the ground had polished the blade. A man walking the ridge with a mattock over his shoulder was clearing land, and clearing land was the most honest thing a mountain man could do. It dug the garden that hid the still. The mattock stayed legal because it was too plainly a tool to ban, and it outlived every weapon on this list. Number 4. A draw knife was the 2-handled blade a mountain man pulled toward himself to shave bark and shape a handle, a foot of straight steel with a wooden grip at each end. Pulled flat, it smoothed an axe haft, but gripped by one handle and swung it was a foot of edged steel with a hooked point. Every man who made his own tools owned one, and the Sevierville Forge turned them out for 60 cents in 1923. The steel was blued and oiled, and it hissed faint against green wood when it cut. A moonshiner who carved his own barrel bungs and tool handles kept a draw knife on his bench, honest as sawdust. It shaped the wood that ran his whole operation. Blade bans of the 1950s reached even the draw knife in the strictest counties. It was a shaping tool for 100 years. Then a clerk decided it was a knife. Number 3. This is the one nobody remembers right. A fro mallet fitted with an iron ring, the coopersmith's driving maul, was a 2-foot club of ironwood banded in a steel collar to keep the head from splitting. The ironwood alone would have served, but the steel band turned the striking end into something between a bat and a hammer, 3 pounds of the hardest material on the mountain. A coopersmith paid 70 cents for one in 1925, and a moonshiner who built his own barrels swung it all day. The steel ring rang a bright note when it struck true. A man carrying a banded maul was building the casks his whole trade depended on, and no revenue agent ever counted a cooper's maul as a weapon. It built the barrels that held the whiskey. When it turned up in a killing near Gatlinburg, the state named ringed mauls as deadly weapons within the year. Number 2. A hay hook was the curved steel hook on a short wooden grip that farmers sank into a bale to drag it across the barn floor. The hook swept out 4 inches, filed to a needlepoint, set into a fist-sized handle a man could palm and hide behind his forearm. Every barn on the mountain had 2 or 3 hanging by the loft door, and a blacksmith made them for $0.25. The point was bright and wickedly fine, and the wood was dark with the sweat of handling. A moonshiner moving hay to cover the mash barrels beneath it carried a hay hook as a matter of course, and it was the last thing anyone read as a weapon. It moved hay, and hay moved feed, and feed fed the mule. Concealed hook statutes in several states finally named it in the 1970s. It hauled a bale its whole life. Then it hauled a man into court. Number 1. Not the corn knife, not the cane knife, the simple sheath knife with the bone handle, the one your grandfather pressed into your palm the first time he trusted you to walk the mountain alone. It was 5 inches of high-carbon steel with a stacked leather or antler grip, carried on the hip of every man who worked wood, hide or field. A good one from the hardware store cost 80 cents in 1922, and it did everything from skinning a rabbit to trimming a bung. The steel took an edge that whispered through leather, and the handle warmed to the hand within a minute. A moonshiner wore it every waking hour, and it was so ordinary that no lawman ever looked at it twice. It was not a weapon, it was the man's own hand in steel. And in the end, most states carved knives like it into their concealed blade codes, and the hardware store knife your great-grandfather wore openly became the thing his descendant hides. 25 ordinary tools, and every one of them stood between a mountain man and the dark. Popular history remembers the flashy ones, the brass knuckles, the slungshot, the loaded cane, because those looked like weapons and got their day in the newspapers. But the ones that mattered most vanished without a record: the darning egg in the sewing basket, the bung mallet on the shelf, the hay hook by the loft door, the fro leaning against the wall. Those were never written down as weapons, and so they were simply forgotten. Go look in your grandfather's old barn, in the drawer by the hearth nobody has opened since he passed. You might be holding something on this list without knowing it. They were not hiding anything, they were simply prepared. And on a dark mountain, with the law coming up the trail, a man learned that the difference between a tool and a weapon was only the moment he needed it to be one.